I was going to say morning, but I suppose it's afternoon now. Good lunchtime, everybody. Just bear with us for a second. We're going to let some numbers in and then we will make a start. So get yourself comfortable, grab a cup of tea, maybe chocolate biscuit, and then we'll be with you in a few minutes. Okay, so I'm going to make a start because we've got a lot of people that are going to be doing some amazing speaking today, and we haven't recorded the conversation we just had before this started. It's obviously going to be quite a passionate debate as well, so we'll allow some time for that. So welcome everybody to today's session. My name is Helen Carter. I work for an organisation called Action Sustainability, and today I wanted to bring to you almost the end of 2.5 years worth of hard work with some amazing people that I've got on the call to try and bring the new British standard, which was going to be launched on Monday. Unfortunately, due to the passing of the Queen, we've not been able to do that officially yet, but it is live. So today is very much sort of like a mini launch, if you like. I think we've beaten BSI to it on what the standard is, what it contains, why it's important. And I have some what I class now as friends, actually, not just colleagues that I've been working with over these years, pulling it together. So what we're going to speak specifically about is the sort of framework organisations can use to try and address modern slavery. This is the first of its kind. And really what we are looking to do is bring together this lovely panel, not so much on the right hand side, but Dr. Alex Troutram, who is an Associate Director and Professor at Nottingham University. I won't hold that against him because I went to Nottingham Uni, but very much the leading sort of academic space in this area, and I've worked with for quite a few years. Also the privilege of introducing Colleen Theron, who's a director at ARDA International. Technically we're competitors, but we do actually work quite closely together as well, because there's just not enough of us. And she's going to be able to talk to you today, and they'll introduce themselves in more detail in a moment. And then Gabriela Gutierrez, who is an associate lecturer at King's College, basically on international business. So again, we've all got our expertise on how this is pulled together, and really you're going to hear from them in the main rather than just myself. So this is a webinar, which means that we've obviously got everybody's camera off. We are going to be recording this. We can send the recording round. We haven't got a huge amount of slides, but there's some useful links in the slides, so we'll make sure you get a copy of those as well. If you've got questions, then please feel free to put them either in the chat or the Q&A, and I will be paying attention to those throughout the session today. And we'll send everything round at the end as a little bit of a thank you for attending this session. So why are we here? If you have a passing interest, or you have a lot of interest in modern slavery, and if your LinkedIn profile is anything like mine, it's probably not sort of avoiding that big report that came out on Monday with regards to the number of modern slavery victims that we have seen. So Global Slavery Index, Walk Free, and the link is on the slide here, produced a really detailed report. I'm still only halfway through, I'm trying to read it, but a huge range of really interesting information on how we've seen the numbers evolve over time and some of the changes that we're seeing. So there's an acceptance that we've seen now an increase of nearly 10 million, so 9.3 million victims of modern slavery. The number now sits at 49.6 million, so not shy of 50 million. People are quite happily talking about 50 million, and we're seeing significant numbers in things like forced labour, which is the area that a lot of us are all sort of really concentrating on at the moment in terms of how we deal with these issues. So we used to tout a lot the numbers back in 2018. The research has been done, the numbers increased, and we've seen it mainly due to this significant increase in vulnerability through things like, you know, civil war, through climate change, through COVID. A lot of those sort of global catastrophes that have been hitting us squarely in the face for quite a few years now are really starting to impact on those sorts of levels and numbers. So everyone can pretty much sit here and say it's horrendous. We all you couldn't not say that, but the reality is we need to do something about it. And that's really why we're here today, in terms of how we bring this together, in terms of making organisations accountable for it. You're going to hear from Colleen in a moment, a little bit later on, around the legislation that's driving this. You'll hear from Gabriella in a moment, looking at why organisations are thinking about this and the pressures on them, and Alex literally providing that overview. But we've been working really hard to pull together this guidance standard that is giving this organisational response. Now, interestingly, I'm procurement by background, have been for quite a few decades. I look very heavily at supply chain, and most people think it's just there. But the beauty of this standard is that it's the organisational, including supply chain response. So you can see on the screen here, the sections 1, 2, 3 have not disappeared. It's just the usual standard of let's define everything. So I haven't included those, but you've got definitions of what we mean by modern slavery, what are vulnerable groups, a real good understanding in terms of who's contained within this standard, the context of the organisation. So thinking about where the organisation operates is important, different sectors, and this is a standard that's applicable to any sector. So it's trying to help businesses think about where they work, what the stakeholders look like, legislation, and linking in with things like bribery and corruption, other sort of connected activities. We didn't want this standard to be a compliance standard. It is a standard that starts to really get those nuances of organisational behaviour. Then, because every business needs to have something in place, we tried to build this in a way that allowed governance to happen, a management system almost. It can embed in the way a business runs. So all of the information about leadership and management, information about policy, who's got responsibility, and when you look at the standard, you'll be surprised there's more than you think. So who are those roles and responsibilities? What sort of support individuals and organisations need? So the role of that in terms of resources, and most of us on this call have been training non-stop for God knows how many years, so training and awareness and competency building. And then thinking about recruitment, so a lot on the worker being part of your organisational response. That's really important, not just about how your organisational response, but how it puts your worker at the heart of it, which is going to be an interesting adaptation from most people's thinking. Terms and conditions, and linked in with things like occupational health and safety. Procurement, my particular passion, not just what's in the PQQ and the ITT, but mapping, supplier engagement, continuous improvement, all those other bits that go within that procurement function are included in here. And then, because you cannot, as my mum used to say, boil the ocean, how do we prioritise? How do we actually really make systemic change? And that's by understanding the risks, understanding how we can really make an impact. And then if we find it, again, what I find a lot is if we find it, we don't know what to do. So how do we respond? How do we look at remediation and bringing into that continuous improvement? So it's a chunky document. It's not slim, but it is, because as you can see, it covers absolutely everything. I will give you some links at the end, but the good news for this is, guess what? It's free. It's not very often we can say that about British Standard, but BSI have been brilliant. They've committed to free distribution for this because they believe so passionately that this isn't about making money on a standard, it's about real change in organisations. So you will see a link at the end that I'll show that means you can literally just download it and read it over a cup of cocoa at night if you want to really get to grips with how it works. It is a guidance standard, not a certifiable standard. But obviously, as I've seen with things like ISO 2400, which is a sustainable procurement standard, you can still get an idea of maturity and evolution within this space. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of people who can go around and help you with that, probably Colleen and me, no doubt, but there will be businesses that can help. But it is a good document to have a look at. So that's the standard. I'll introduce you to each of those sections a little bit later in the next month or so, and we're going to do some separate bits on each bit. And hi Nico, I'll answer your question in a moment. We will actually go into, I think, the discussion now with some of the key people on the call as to why it was created, why we feel it's important, and actually why individuals got involved in those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and hold on 2 seconds. Stop share, Helen. I'm going to come to our lovely panel, and I'm going to start with Alex. Alex, you actually took the responsibility for trying to keep us all in order and chair the whole thing. So do you want to just give a quick introduction to yourself, and do you want to give your insight into why you think the standard was required, maybe an insight into the process, and what you think some of the benefits are associated with this?
Yeah, sure. Alex Todrums, I'm Professor of Supply Chain Management at the University of Nottingham and an Associate Director at the Rights Lab here, which is the world's largest research center on modern slavery. And yeah, Helen and I have been working together since 2015, maybe 14 even, on modern slavery, particularly in construction businesses, but also on wider pieces. And so I think there's a number of really good reasons why I wanted to be involved in chairing this committee is that there's a lot more legislation coming up. There's a lot more developments that are happening, so there's a lot of business interest in what are good solutions. What do you suggest that we should be doing? So we have businesses who are actually interested in actively working against modern slavery. What can we actually advise them to do? And I think, since we started working on modern slavery all those years ago, we have a lot more knowledge to offer. There is a lot that we've learned over those years, and I think it was really important to share that and to share it and bring it together really in a comprehensive approach. So I think there's fantastic resources out there. They usually focus on specific areas of the world or specific areas of the business, or they're only looking at procurement, or they're only looking at remediation. So bringing this together in really a comprehensive document that is organized around the management system, I think that was really quite important to me. And of course, now that we have a national standard on this, when we look at what can we expect businesses to do, they can't say anymore they didn't know, because that advice is out there, it's for free. And so there is, I think, this standard that is, I think, setting the bar a little bit higher, and the knowledge is out there and it's available. So I think that was one really big motivation to really support organizations in working against modern slavery. And I think we had a really fantastic committee, put quite a lot of effort into the composition, and bringing people together is a great mix. And I think that's also quite different to a lot of other documents out there. It was a mix of business practitioners, NGOs, academics, and of course also our survivor consultants on the committee. So there were a lot of very different perspectives that were feeding into the standard, and that really, despite of the many arguments and confrontations we may have had on the committee, but I think it made the standard really, a lot better through that discussion and the input from so many different fields of expertise. And I think we could also see that in the very strong response to the public consultation. Every standard before it's being published goes through a public consultation process, and we got a lot of responses from inside and outside the UK. So it really raised interest from many stakeholder groups, many areas of the world. So I think there was really a huge appetite for having a standard developed in the public area. And yeah, so a great benefit I think here is that the standard starts from a perspective of vulnerabilities and risks that are inside and outside the organization. And I think that is really quite important. And it is to start from a perspective of what makes people and organizations vulnerable to modern slavery, and then think about what does that mean for the organization. It's a very comprehensive standard because it needs to work for everyone. It needs to work for a retailer, for a construction SME. So that makes it very wide. And I really hope that people don't get overwhelmed or lost in its comprehensiveness. And maybe Gary or Colleen will speak to this later. We don't necessarily expect businesses to cover 100% of the standard. It's very comprehensive. But it really is organized around this management system that is then taking you into individual corporate functions and actually activities with much more detailed advice. What if you identify that this is the main area where you should be focusing on as an organization, then here is what experts have said is the way to do it. So I think really have a look at it. Don't be scared by the size of the document, and think about how it actually relates to your organization, and think about the people and risk factors that you have. So yeah, I think that was why I was getting involved. I think was great actually also to work as a committee online. Thanks to COVID, we got a much wider franchise, I think, in participation from all regions of the UK, but also again international contributions. So that was probably one of the benefits of the pandemic, of having run things mainly online. And yeah, really pleased that this standard is now published, and yeah, really looking forward also to hear back from people who are using it or reading it over the next weeks. What their feedback is, and what we could change in the next round of the standard.
Please don't say next round of the standards. First, let's just get this one over and done with. I like the comment that you made there around the holistic, and I think I find that, and it'll be interesting to hear the other guys on the call as well. People tend to just go, I'm looking at procurement, or I look at my recruitment, or I look at, and they pick an element, but they don't necessarily think about that whole structure, the whole organizational response. So I think that's a real benefit, and I like the point you made about it could be a retailer, it could be an SME, because it's guidance. I think that's also a really important bit, that it can be adjusted and applied to fit your business, and I think that's a real strength. Yeah, and I don't think we all actually physically met. Alex and Colleen, I know we've met before, but yeah, not mentioned before. Not met Gabby, we've not actually physically met yet either. So that was a benefit, and it's not meeting you, but a benefit of having more people online. That real mix of standards keeping us in line, but also plain English speaking. Does this make sense? What does that mean to people? There was a lot of time and effort over that, and you kept us in line. Thanks, Alex. Okay, so that hands me over nicely to Gabby then. Gabby, obviously you've got the sort of international business context, and you did take a lot of time looking at sort of like the contextual aspect of it. So do you want to give us a bit of an introduction to yourself, why you were involved, and the benefits you can see, but also that organizational context of how it all applies?
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar today. And it's a real pleasure to share with you what we have been working on for the last couple of years. So like Helen mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in international management at King's College London. And my past research has focused on the management of global CSR standards in multinational corporations. And I started researching modern slavery in 2015, but this was really the early days when the Modern Slavery Act came into force. And I have been closely interested in understanding why and how modern slavery is interpreted very differently by organizations, by practitioners, by policymakers. And even if we look at the anti-slavery movement, there are also very different, I would say, political views on what the issue is and how it should be solved. So what we did, it was some research in also the construction sector. So I think that's, we share also some, the context where we operate. And the research showed us that the way in which modern slavery is defined will have implications to how organizations respond to it. And this will ultimately, well, it was hindering the emergence of collective solutions to deal with the issue. So I joined the committee with this concern, and my work in the committee has been advocating that the standard needed to be mindful about the way we portrayed modern slavery. So through the various contributions and discussions that we had, I think we were able to develop a standard that brings together all the different aspects of the problem from an economic perspective. So really shedding light on the structures of the global economy that cause this problem, and how the organizations have a connection to those structures, are even contributing to those structures. And we also brought the more social justice understanding of the issue, which puts human rights and labor rights at the core, drawing attention to notions like human dignity and decent work. So I think one of the key achievements of the standard is that it really moves away from a narrow understanding of modern slavery that is often seen as something isolated that occurs in a vacuum and for which organizations are neither responsible or contributors. We brought this positioning to the standard, and I'm sure many of you, you may be familiar with this analogy of a continuum to understand modern slavery. But we really made sure that we were also reflecting on these severe forms of labor exploitation that are connected to poor working and living conditions that harm human dignity. So now thinking, and I guess this is a nice exercise, Helen, just thinking, I guess we jumped in, when we saw the opportunity to be part in this standard, but, just reflecting on why is the standard required and, the context of how this emerged. I will pick 3 points. And I think, Helen, you already started talking about, the magnitude and urgency of the issue. And as we see with these estimates that this is highly alarming. We know that modern slavery is a significant threat to the sustainability agenda. As you know, we have a SDG goal that explicitly is including a call for global action to eradicate modern slavery and related practices like human trafficking. But we also know that modern slavery interferes with achieving other goals, like reducing inequality and poverty. Now, of course, since the SDGs were introduced, we see there's a lot of attention, particularly to the role of business, helping to address the issue. And alongside, we see numerous factors driving corporate action. We see pressure from NGOs, all the reputational and financial risk. Investors are obviously putting more pressure and more attention on where their money is going to. And I think there's also the ethical argument that many companies also don't want the activities or business relationships of their organizations to contribute and to be part of this problem. Now, in the UK, of course, we see the Modern Slavery Act was a key driver with the provision of Section 54, transparency and supply chains, that it requires organizations to provide this statement outlining the steps that they are taking or not taking to address modern slavery and their supply chains. But there have been numerous criticisms and shortcomings in legislation. So I think one of the key ones has been the problems around the inconsistency in the quality of the statements, but also the focus on legislation on transparency and reporting rather than the actual steps that organizations are taking to address the issue. So I think the standard in some way is motivated by the dissatisfaction with current legal instruments and the way in which the companies and other organizations are reacting to this. But really, what we wanted this standard to be a guidance to help to educate organizations to fill in this gap, like Alex already said, raise the bar on combating modern slavery. And I think I see it also, why is the standard needed? I think in our research, we also, we really found that there was this complacency and almost, I would say, fatalistic view that, the problem is really, an outcome of the global economy and there's nothing much that can be done. So I think Alex already was, saying this, we offer a comprehensive range of practical things that organizations can do. So it's really any organization, any type, size, and we acknowledge that some companies or some organizations also may be more advanced in this journey. So may have already excellent processes in place around health and safety, ethical procurement, or Helen mentioned corruption and other issues. So there's lots of things that organizations can draw upon that are already in place, and then they can use it as a way to either raise their game. For those that are already more advanced, this can be a tool for, as a sounding board to see how they are performing. And I think for some SMEs, some that are at the very early stages of their journey, I think it's a way to prioritize some of these areas. And we are very mindful that, in terms of resources, SMEs don't have the scale of resources as these multinationals. So I think we were careful to signpost in the standard those areas where SMEs have in place, or there may be someone who may be already dealing with specific issues, and that person may be actually doing ethical procurement and HR functions, and be the champion, the ethical champion in the company. So I think we were able to signpost those things in the standard. So also keen to see how this is going to be implemented in organizations, and I guess tracing really how this is changing the perception of modern slavery, but also the more whether this is raising the game to companies and enabling them to be more responsible.
Brilliant, Gabrielle, that's fantastic. And I think there's a couple of key points for me, and also to put a shine of a light on some of the conversations we had in the committee. If you notice, the title of the standard is Organisational Response to Modern Slavery. It is not how to comply with the Modern Slavery Act. It is not how to write your modern slavery statement. It is not about legal compliance. I think it's really important that, or how to be able to claim you have no modern slavery in your organisation, is very much centering around this grown-up and responsible approach to identifying and sort of preventing and mitigating and remediating, which is exactly what businesses should be doing. So there are elements, you won't necessarily go in there and there isn't a section that says this is how you write your modern slavery statement. As Gabby's already said, there's some links to things that we'd recommend, but it's very much the whole, if you want to write a statement that's got teeth and information that really is going to show you're taking this seriously, here's how you do it. Here's how the information is that you need to be able to look at. So compliance is not something we've talked about, or we have talked about. It's not included in here anywhere. This is not compliance, compliance, compliance. It's very much that journey, I think, which is really important. So Gabby's also right, highlighting the fact that we linked to as many resources as we could. And Nico, I've seen your question around how does it relate to BS6002. We did a huge gap analysis at the beginning of all the different standards that were out there. Does it complement? Can we pull references in from those? BS6002 is a very industry specific thing, so we made sure that there was references to all those things that were out there. It should be the best of the best, without trying to sound cocky, but it should be the best of everything that's out there, and help those front runners, as Gabby really said, soundboard themselves with there, or those that have got no idea, a good stepping stone. So thank you for that, Gabby. We'll come back and do some questions at the end. So Colleen, that brings us over to yourself in terms of, we've sort of alluded and touched a little bit on sort of the why, but the world is getting a lot more transparent and scary, and lots of things going on, and organisations and governments are trying to address this. So do you want to give your perception in terms of why you did it and joined, but also then obviously what you're seeing that organisations need to deal with, particularly from a legislative perspective, but other pressures too? Thanks,
Helen. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I think, as Helen has said, we've known each other for some time. We should technically be competitors, but we do try and work together and support each other in a number of different things. And both Alex and Gabby have known you also over a period of time, and it was an absolute delight being asked to serve on the committee. I found it's a real honor to be amongst so many people who, by and large, have known, and I think most of us did know each other in different contexts from different parts of, society, really, who had passion around the issue of modern slavery. And I do think that, many of the people who sat on that committee has at their heart the desire for change, systemic change, and for an understanding that this isn't just, as Gabby was saying, something that is alluded to, it's written about, it's numbers, as we see on the report that you've just said, but actually that they are, very real people who are vulnerable involved in this. And I think what I found, personally really edifying as part of this committee was how often the conversation did come back to, well, what about the people? How does this actually reflect the fact that they are, people who are vulnerable in this? And we did have a lot of conversations, even as, Helen was saying about the actual heading, what the standard would be called. That in itself prompted quite a lot of discussion and debate. And you know, Alex, to Helen's point, we really did appreciate having you sort of chair that and bring us in line when it was necessary, and you know, really have to hone in at the times that we had to think about the structure of this. So my, you know, my involvement was really a kind of a combination of my interest in the law underpinning, you know, change in society, change to business, and involvement around modern slavery issues, and the ability to work with a group of experts and such a broad-ranging side. I mean, you know, Helen, you've worked on ISO 20400 with procurement. I worked on ISO 20121. It was a very, very different experience. Certainly didn't have the range of people and experts who were involved. So that was the reason I got involved. It was by no means easy. I think we can all say there were times we didn't want to be there. And when we looked at those comments, I wanted to pull out what hair I'd left as we went through them. So why I think as well the standard is required is that, you know, before I perhaps talk a little bit about legislation, is that, you know, Alex had mentioned that there have been so many different responses to modern slavery, as Gabby has said that as well. And the need perhaps to really think about this in a systemic way was what I think drove the conversation many years ago. I think it was before COVID, Helen, when we stood at a BSI committee with Amanda talking about whether this should be a standard or shouldn't. And in fact, actually, there were a lot of people that thought it shouldn't be a standard, if I remember correctly. So I think the idea of trying to at least codify, if you want to use a legal word, the experience and the requirements that, you know, businesses, both small, large, and organizations can look to as a guide on how they might address this issue and how they might implement it. And so I think, you know, that for me was a critical function. On a very personal level, it was a wonderful opportunity to think about how we write in legal compliance and organizational compliance. You know, the standard goes further than most ISO standards. We actually even address how legal counsel should approach the issue. And that's from a personal point of view. I think I deal with a lot of in-house lawyers, and actually often legal counsel have no idea about this. It might be shipped off to HR. It might, you know, if we're talking about modern slavery statements, it might be sitting within in other parts of their in-house team. And we just thought that, you know, trying to shine some more light on the kind of legislative element would be important. I do want to say that when we think about the law in relation to modern slavery and addressing this issue, if we look back over a period since, you know, 2011, when the UN Guiding Principles were first created as an authoritative global standard setting or addressing how business should deal with human rights related risks, we see this tremendous change in the legislative landscape. We initially saw, you know, how governments were starting to, and regulators were starting to introduce legislative mandatory requirements around actual responsible business elements like bribery, like corruption, like health and safety and environmental risks. But that momentum has increased by, you know, an understanding really that the voluntary requirements for business to self-certify and to really, you know, look at how they address issues in their supply chain around human rights impacts has just not been sufficient. And so what we've experienced is this raft of law that has been created, firstly, I think with a focus on reporting. So in the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, in Australia and California, there is an emphasis on reporting on the steps you're taking to address modern slavery. But the change that we're seeing around the newer legislation is this introduction of corporate obligations that are significantly broader, which is the requirement that you actually can evidence the actions you are taking, the due diligence that you are putting in place to address these issues. And I think that, you know, and for those of you who are following the EU legislation, there's the corporate sustainability due diligence legislation. There's actually peripheral legislation, which is driving a lot of change around import bans. We were just talking about that before this webinar. But, you know, the raft of legislation requiring transparency and accountability is just getting greater. And I think when we think about the standard, I think what was important also for us was to reference how the risk of modern slavery sits in a broader human rights risk framework. So we've tried to do that. We've also actually tried to reference the UNGPs because we thought it was essential that that was, you know, part of the narrative, because we know that for you know, whilst it's a voluntary framework, in fact, most of the legislation that we see in Europe and coming out of the EU references the UNGPs as the framework that businesses should draw on if they are, when they are developing their due diligence standards. So the other element I would think that was really interesting about when we talked about sort of the regulatory piece is that we actually also looked at how this interacts with climate change. And that's so new. You know, when I started work in modern slavery, nobody was properly connecting the environmental and the human rights side. You know, we'd seen things like Kevin Bales had written, you know, an interesting book. There'd been a little bit of peripheral studies around this connection, but it's becoming far more mainstream now. And so all those, I guess all those connections we try to think about when we put the wording together. And I guess, you know, just probably to stop there, I think, you know, with organizations that are going to want to look to the standard, what is really key is the systemic cultural shift that we spent a lot of time thinking about. And I do agree with, you know, all the panelists is that, you know, legislation is always the benchmark. Whatever you do, you have to meet compliance. But for organizations that really are looking to drive change and actually are driving change, they are having to meet standards that go beyond the law. And I think that the cultural piece that was being written into this is really being critical. And, you know, I would hope that anybody that's going to use this, when they think about how they address the law in this, to address it in such a way that they will look at the law as that benchmark, but actually drive the change beyond that.
Brilliant.
So I'll stop there then, Helen.
Thanks, Colleen. No, don't worry, that's fine. No, I think there's some really interesting points there. So we did make sure that in there, although it's an organisational response, we were considering obviously that legislative landscape and the fact that it took us 2.5 years to pull together. And the legislation is very different from when it was when we started the conversation. And most of it is going down this, prove it. Prove what you're doing, show me what you're doing, not just put a piece of paper out there that says what you're doing, but we need to see the evidence. And that landscape's not going to change. I think if anything, it's going to get harder and more severe. People have woken up to supply chains. They've realized they exist. And that's where we're starting to see these issues. So thank you, Colleen. That really does give a good overview of the fact that we try to future-proof it as much as possible. And regardless of what Alex says, we don't want to rewrite it yet, but we will obviously make sure that gives us a little bit of a time lag, which is important. So I've got a couple of questions that have come in that I'm going to go through in a second that will help a little bit, but I've got a question mainly, and if we can sort of do a quick answer, because I want to just make sure they understand the links as well. If you were to say the one thing that's going to surprise people when they read this, apart from the fact that it's quite hefty, what do you think the biggest surprise is going to be, and what do you think the biggest challenge is going to be for individuals? So Gabby, I'll start with you. What do you think the biggest sort of surprise will be for people, and what do you think will be the most useful sort of challenge bit that will help them?
I think something that would surprise people as soon as they, as you say, it's a chunky document, would be the fact that we have been saying it, that is an educational piece, and the fact that we really start giving an overview of the issue and building the connections then, step by step to the organization. So you will not start seeing and having the guidance straight away, the meaty thing, let's say, of how to get things done. I think we expect that companies, broaden their perspective in how they are understanding modern slavery. So I think that's something that, I'm not an expert in standards, but that may be different from other pieces where probably you don't have those very lengthy explanations of really, this is what is going on. The landscape is so, different, the intersectionalities with all these other issues around climate change, around, that I think it will surprise people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So our advice is that section 0 at the very, very beginning, don't skip that bit, because that really does, and my experience, the same as probably the guys, is people don't take enough time to understand the vulnerabilities, what modern slavery actually is. They jump straight to the answer. So that's a really useful element of the guide, I think, that helps set the scene for you going forward. So I suppose it's the same question then to Alex. What do you think? Is there anything different that you think would surprise people, and any useful bit that you think would address the challenge they're trying to get to?
Yeah, I completely agree with Gabby. I think that's very different to other standards, to actually explain who are the affected populations, and to kind of think about those people that are affected before we think about the business. And that was one of the big arguments we had on the committee, in that sense, like this is different to other risks to an organization. Like this is different to a supplier defaulting, right? This is about people, and I think that's an important piece to approach it from that perspective. I think the other issue that some may find surprising, others not, is this arrangement around a management system. So this, it's not just my department, and I think we probably, most of us work with organizations that they do like great stuff here, they do great stuff there, and then we have a highly motivated director of something somewhere, and they're doing great stuff. But this kind of putting this together as an organization, as an orchestrated system, I think that is important. And I think maybe not so much a surprise, but I think many here, probably also on the webinar, what they will recognize is that often this gap between the governing body and the board and the beautiful policies and then the implementation. And I think that's also an area that the standard is really covering quite well. This from the governance role of the organization to the people who are doing stuff, that gap. And I think that is also an area where the standard works really well in translating that through the organization and hopefully making this gap a bit narrower.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thanks, Alex. So I suppose the same question then to Colleen, and then I'll go to the questions in the group before I finish off.
Yeah, thank you. And for Alex and Gabby, I agree with both of you. I think, probably I was going to say the same thing as Alex. The surprise might be is that, kind of focus on if you read it properly, what are we looking at in terms of vulnerability of people? For me, I guess, perhaps this is part of what is the most useful for people, but perhaps surprising too is also that governance and leadership piece, and the roles and responsibilities, which has really been woven through. And I looked actually just at the standard while Alex was talking, and when you look at the roles around top management, I'm sure if we had to compare that to some of the other ISO standards, it's probably double what I saw, certainly I think in the ISO 2012-1 is, and that goes to this kind of governance piece and the importance around that. So yeah, I think I'm in agreement with the two of you. I think there will be people that will look at this and think, I can't read it, it's too long, I don't know where to start. But I'm hoping that for many people that won't be the response. It will be a question of how can I really get to grips with the content and chew over it and figure out how I use this effectively in my business.
Brilliant, thanks, Colleen. We'll do a little bit of help with you for the people on the call a little bit later on. I'll show you some breakdowns of how we can help you go through that through some webinars that we're running. So yeah, I'll help with that a little bit, and I'm sure these guys are going to probably be on there as well with me. So a couple of things then from me. Somebody's actually put a question around not a certification standard. So does it mean they self-certify? If anybody on this call is familiar with ISO 2400, which is the standard that obviously my organisation's been involved with on sustainable procurement, it's built almost like a guidebook. So the principle is that if you go through, you can almost check where you are in terms of the journey. I've got this bit, I haven't got that bit. So there's no self-certification as such. You can look at it and say, actually, I'm working like that. I'm in accordance with it. And you probably could quote it. The world over the next 12 months is no doubt going to end up with people who say that they can help you with it. That's not a problem at all. But if anybody tells you they can certify to it, it's wrong. But use it like a maturity matrix. Look at how you start to evolve and improve. You may find you're at the beginning in some spaces and way ahead in the other. So you can use it, you can reference it, use it as a guidebook and implementation. We didn't want to go certifiable because it's not that easy. It's not a tick box exercise. And in fact, there's already talk about maybe turning it into an ISO. And I should imagine at some point, if it goes down that route, we'll be arguing as strong not to go down a certifiable route for exactly that reason. If it's complex in the UK, it's really complex globally. Certification standards don't always work. So self-certify, not necessarily, but you could say you're working in accordance with it if you're using it as your sort of manual, if you like, which is a way to do it. Public sector organisations, yes, we thought about you, definitely. The language, we did spend a lot of time talking about various different bits of language. Does this apply to lots of? Hopefully we got it right. But in certain instances, the principle are you will have a recruitment, you will have procurement, you'll have people giving you legal advice, you will have top people guiding your direction. If you're in public or private, yes, it won't fit exactly because it's quite a generic standard, but you can apply it because the principles are all the same. It doesn't matter whether you're public sector or private sector. And then one for everybody. I think that's Terry. So here's a question for everybody. When engaging and consulting with people from countries outside the UK, were you surprised by any comments or perspectives on what modern slavery was meant? And what observations and differences did you see from different cultures? And are there any cultural strengths you brought to address to this global challenge? Really interesting question, Terry. And in fact, it's kind of interesting because if you actually look at the makeup of the panel, there weren't many British of us. We're a multicultural panel, which I think is also a big strength. So I'll throw that question at Alex. What do you think? Because obviously you were head honcho and looking after us all. What did you see from that perspective?
Yeah, so we got a lot of perspectives from around the world, but everyone on the committee, because it's self-selected to be on the committee, I think, and being interested in this topic in the first place, I think actually in terms of alignment of thinking, it was quite global. So I think that's probably good news for the modern slave or anti-slavery movement, right? I think our thinking about this as a global business problem is there weren't huge differences, but I think the standard also gives you enough flexibility to implement it in different cultural contexts of the organization. So yeah, I think fully recognizing that suppliers may be in other parts of the world, parts of the organization might be in different parts of the world, and I think the standard is flexible enough to adjust that. It has, for example, also a section on communication, and quite recognizes that communication needs to be work for the audience that it's addressing, and so that's, I think we've kind of incorporated that global character of the problem and the global character of business. But I think the really big challenge in terms of standards negotiation and cultural perceptions of modern slavery, that will be the ISO situation. That will probably quite an exciting field for any ethnographer or anthropologist.
Yeah, I think that's quite important. So I mean, culturally, by calling it responding to modern slavery, immediately gives you cultural challenges, because globally, it's not always called that. So what we did actually do, and there was a great amount of work from some of the guys on the call, and I have to confess, this isn't just the committee guys, these are the people that didn't have other plans that were able to talk to me. The committee has some amazing people on it. We had some really good sort of cross-functional organisational representatives. But what that did allow us to do was make sure that we picked up the aspects of vulnerabilities, and they're the same wherever you go. So that does allow that, I think, Alex's point of it being applicable across the board. The modern slavery bit would turn some countries off, but the principles are no different. We looked at all the due diligence that should be across the globe, and a lot of the vulnerabilities across the globe. So it should have that flexibility. But yes, there's already murmurings and whisperings of an ISO standard off the back of it, and that will be as my mum said, a bun fight, trying to work out how we're going to define all that stuff. But for now, this helps us, and it helps us with that international landscape as well, which is really good. Okay,
Helen,
I'm conscious. Go on, Gabby, go on.
Can I add something just
on
the culture? Thank you. On the cultural differences, and we have already mentioned that we try to align it with the language of the UNGPs, and I think the UNGPs it has a very strong, you know, argument that when organizations operate in countries that are not providing those minimum human rights safeguards, that you know, the organizations should follow international good practice. Yeah. And I hear that, you know, we acknowledge that the organizations may actually face and encounter those very tricky, you know, ethical dilemmas of what do we do and how do we do, you know, with our suppliers, knowing that they are in those countries where maybe, you know, expectations are different. But I guess, you know, as part of, you know, creating a standard that raises the bar, I guess we also wanted to send that message across that, you know, it's not good enough just to, you know, do as in Rome, and when you operate there, it's about bringing, you know, achieving international good practice.
Yeah, definitely.
And actually, sorry, Helen, I thought just to go, you know, just to add to what Gabby said, I think what was really interesting when you look at the preamble too, is that well, there were two things. There was one is, you know, really making it clear how, you know, modern slavery practices sit at the extreme of a continuum of exploitation. So, you know, for organizations who see modern slavery at the end of that, there's actually the range of understanding what is decent work. And I think that actually, when you look at what is written into the standard about modern slavery risk factors and vulnerable workers and groups, there's some real guidance there about, you know, globally how you might be treating different vulnerable groups in different areas, and providing the context of actually, you know, if you're setting a bar to address modern slavery, that might even be too high. You know, maybe you start with looking at decent work, and you know, that's really been kind of knitted into the standard, which I think adds to its value. Definitely, and I think a lot of it, because there's also prevention, and prevention is very much about how we address the vulnerabilities to ensure it doesn't happen. So more and more organisations I'm speaking to, I know the panel is speaking to, your solution to addressing modern slavery isn't a tick box or a checking documents or even doing worker voice audits in isolation. It's about how do we actually address some of those vulnerable issues to start off with, to ensure that we don't end up forcing individuals into those situations. So you'll see it with living wage, you'll see it with recruitment fees, you'll see it with all the sorts of things that create that environment. And this is what the standard is doing. So some of you would look at a standard and think, oh, okay, this is just literally that checklist of what I need to do. No, it really tries to sort of get through the backbone of that. Hence why there's a lot on governance, there's a lot on management, because it will be a challenge. But it's a challenge that we feel is worth, and there are businesses doing it. They've provided information in that space as well. So yeah, very, very much useful in that space. Okay, I'm conscious that we are getting close to the end. So what I want to do is just share a couple of slides with you before we disappear off. So bear with me. So as I've mentioned, it's free. So even if nothing else, you don't have to pay it. You can read and you can decide you don't want to deal with it, but it's there. So download it. When we send the slides around, you'll see the link. There's an executive summary that you can download, and there's the full document itself.
And I am sure at some point we will be able to speak to some other individuals in BSI, and there'll be a big official launch that will look at how we do it. If nothing else, the committee will get together and have a toast and a congratulations, we did it type thing. But we will definitely end up with an official launch. What I would also say though is we have got in AS some events that we're going to be running in November. I'm calling it our Modern Slavery series. I appreciate that most of you come on here and thought, well, you haven't told me everything I need to know about the individual bits of the standard. That could take us ages. There's a lot in there, as we've already said. So hopefully we've done a little bit of hearts and minds, got you interested. My challenge between now and those dates is download it, read it. We'll give you a month and then come and talk to us. So I'll be catching up with some of my colleagues on the committee, and we're breaking it down into the component parts so we can take a little bit about what does that policy look like, what does the governance look like, what does the awareness and competency, what does grievance and remediation look like, and my personal favourite, being a procurement person, how we get procurement to really be proactive in this space and get beyond tier 1 and start to look in those areas. And then finally, at the end of this campaign, the bit that we've all alluded to, so bringing modern slavery as part of that. Let's talk just transition alone. I mean, it could be part of a bigger sustainability piece. It should be, but definitely in our world of just transition, as we're speaking about the climate change and the carbon agenda, the two have to go hand in hand. So how do we do that? How are organisations doing that? And if anybody knows me on this call, I can see some of you. If I say solar panels, you know, that's my hot topic. So that's exactly what we're talking about. So we'll be able to sort of dive into that in a little bit more detail. So from my perspective, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because you don't need to see my mug. I want to say a massive thank you, and as a pleasure as always to speaking to you guys. So thank you, Alex. Thank you, Gabby, and thank you, Colleen. Thank you for all of you who've attended, and thank you for all your questions. Keep in touch with regards to what's happening, both with all of us. I mean, our details are on the screen, but we're all going to be sort of talking about this. I want to say a big thank you to the people who are on the call that we're also in the committee. There's not just us, we're a lot of us dealing with it. So a thank you to you guys as well, and we can all catch up on that space. But go, read, enjoy, and keep out over the next few months and have a look, because at the end of the day, all we want to do is help businesses start to really seriously address the issue of modern slavery and some pretty egregious breaches of human rights in supply chains. So this is our gift to say, have a look, do, and yeah, keep in touch. Enjoy your weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks.
Have a good week.
Helen.
Bye.